My name is Ayana Crowfeather, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 7 years now. People always ask why someone would choose to live in isolation, miles from civilization, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and the constant threat of death. The answer isn't simple, but it starts with my grandfather. He was Tlingit from southeast Alaska, and he used to tell me stories about the old ways, about spirits that walked the land long before white settlers arrived. The forest remembers everything, he'd say, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the air. Every footstep, every breath, every death, some things should be left undisturbed. I thought they were just stories then. I was wrong. I came to work at Katmai National Park after finishing my degree in wildlife management and completing the grueling federal law enforcement training required for park rangers. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd grown up in small Alaskan towns where your nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away. What drew me here was the purity of it, the idea that I could protect something truly wild, something unchanged by human interference. My station is a small ranger cabin situated on the shores of Naknek Lake, about 15 miles from the nearest park headquarters. Sing it. The cabin itself is nothing fancy. 2 rooms, a wood stove, solar panels, and a radio that works when the weather cooperates. From my front porch, I can see across the lake to the volcanic peaks of the Aleutian Range, their snow-covered summits piercing the sky like ancient monuments. The work itself involves everything you'd expect and plenty you wouldn't. Wildlife monitoring, search and rescue operations, campground maintenance, visitor education, and law enforcement. During peak season, I might see a dozen visitors a day. During winter, I might not see another human being for months, but it's not the isolation that gets to you out here. It's the sounds. Alaska has a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially during the long winter nights when darkness stretches for 18 hours. The wind through the trees can sound like voices calling your name. Ice shifting on the lake creates groans and cracks that echo like footsteps, and sometimes, just sometimes, you hear things that have no natural explanation. I'd been at the station for 3 years when I first encountered something that challenged everything. I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late September, that time of year when the tourist season winds down and the serious cold hasn't yet set in. The trees were showing their fall colors, brilliant yellows and deep reds that seemed to glow against the backdrop of evergreens. I was conducting my evening radio check with headquarters when dispatch crackled through with a missing person report. 2 hikers, Marcus Red and Jennifer Walsh, had failed to check in at their planned pickup point near the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. They'd been due back 2 days ago. New Apuri. Search and rescue in Alaska isn't like anywhere else. The sheer scale of the wilderness means that finding someone can be like locating a single grain of sand on a beach. Weather can turn deadly in minutes. Rivers that look crossable can hide treacherous currents. And then there are the animals, brown bears that can weigh over 1,000 pounds, wolves, and worse things that don't appear in any wildlife manual. I loaded my pack with emergency gear, medical supplies, and 3 days' worth of food. My GPS unit showed the hiker's last known position was approximately 12 miles northeast of my station, in rough country where the forest meets the volcanic Badlands. The terrain there is a maze of ravines, hot springs, and unstable ground that can collapse without warning. The first day of searching turned up nothing. I followed their planned route, marking locations with my GPS and calling their names every few hundred yards. No response except the echo of my own voice bouncing off the canyon walls, zing off the canyon walls. I found their first camping spot easily enough. A cleared area near a small creek where they'd built a proper fire ring and hung their food bags correctly to avoid bears. Everything looked normal. Their second camp was different. I found it just before sunset, about 6 miles deeper into the backcountry. The tent was still standing, but something was wrong with the whole scene. The fire ring looked like it had been kicked apart, with charred logs scattered in a wide circle. Their gear was strewn around the campsite, not like someone had packed quickly, but like something had torn through their belongings with violent intent. What bothered me most was the silence. In healthy wilderness, there's always sound, birds, insects, small mammals moving through the underbrush. But this place was utterly quiet, as if every living thing had fled. Even the wind seemed to avoid this spot. I set up my own camp about a 1/4 mile away, following standard protocol to avoid contaminating the scene. As darkness fell, I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. The hikers' sleeping bags were missing, along with most of their food and water, but their expensive camera equipment was untouched, scattered on the ground next to torn clothing. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me reach for the .40 caliber pistol on my hip. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from deep underground. It lasted for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Following the hiker's trail became increasingly difficult as I moved deeper into the volcanic region. The ground here was a mixture of loose ash and sharp obsidian fragments that showed footprints poorly and made quiet movement impossible. Around midday, I found something that changed everything. It was a single boot print in a patch of soft ash near a steaming hot spring. The print was enormous, at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with distinct toe marks that looked almost human but wrong in some fundamental way. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it weighed several hundred pounds. I'd seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, including massive coastal brown bears, but this was different. Bears don't leave toe prints like this, and even the largest bear paws don't approach this size. And that's row. I took measurements and photographs, trying to maintain scientific objectivity even as a cold fear began to settle in my chest. Following the strange tracks led me to a series of caves carved into the volcanic rock by centuries of geothermal activity. The openings were larger than I'd expected, big enough for a person to walk through upright. Steam vented from several of the entrances, creating an otherworldly atmosphere of shifting mist and sulfurous smells. I called out for the missing hikers, my voice echoing strangely in the cavern system. For a moment, I thought I heard a response, a faint cry that might have been human. But when I called again, there was only silence. Standing at the mouth of that cave system, with those impossible footprints behind me and the absolute silence of the dead forest around me, I realized that my grandfather's stories might not have been stories at all. Some things he'd told me were older than the land itself. Some things had been here long before humans arrived, and they didn't take kindly to trespassers. I keyed my radio and called for backup, requesting a full search team and possibly a helicopter if weather permitted. But as I waited for a response, the radio produced only static. I was on my own, 15 miles from help, with night approaching and something in those caves that had left tracks unlike anything in the natural world. The wind picked up as the sun began to set, carrying with it a smell I'd never encountered before, something like burning sage mixed with rotting meat. And from somewhere deep in the cave system, I heard that rhythmic drumming again, accompanied by what sounded like voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I made camp a safe distance from the caves, but close enough to maintain surveillance. Whatever was in there, it had answers about the missing hiker, and despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat, I knew I had to go in. I waited until 3 a.m. to enter the caves, reasoning that if something dangerous was using them as a lair, it might be less active during the deepest part of the night. My headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing smooth walls carved by millennia of hot water flow. The air was warm and humid, carrying that strange mix of sulfur and decay that seemed to get stronger the deeper I went. The cave system was more extensive than I'd imagined. Multiple passages branched off from the main tunnel, some leading upward toward the surface, others descending deeper into the earth. I followed the largest passage, marking my route with reflective tape every 50 feet to ensure I could find my way back. About 200 yards in, I found the first sign of the missing hikers. It was Jennifer's backpack, torn open and partially buried under loose rocks. The contents were scattered: water bottles, energy bars, a fleece jacket, but the sleeping bag was missing. More disturbing were the claw marks on the pack's fabric, tears that looked like they'd been made by fingernails rather than animal claws. I collected what I could and continued deeper. The passage opened into a large chamber heated by a pool of naturally warm water. Steam rose from the surface, creating an almost tropical atmosphere that felt completely wrong in the Alaskan wilderness. And there, on the far side of the pool, I saw something that made me question my sanity. It was a pile of bones, bleached white and stacked with deliberate care. Human bones arranged in patterns that reminded me of the ceremonial layouts my grandfather had described from the old Thingit traditions. But these weren't ancient artifacts. Some of the bones still had tissue attached, and the smell of decomposition was overwhelming. Among the bones, I found personal items: a wedding ring, a driver's license from Montana, a child's toy dinosaur. These weren't from Marcus and Jennifer. They were from other people, probably hikers and hunters who had disappeared over the years in unexplained circumstances. I was photographing the bone pile when I heard movement behind me. The sound was barely perceptible, just a whisper of something large moving carefully across stone. I turned slowly, my hand moving to my weapon, and saw a shadow retreat into one of the side passages. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something that defied description, tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that was definitely not human, but not quite animal either. "I know you're there," I called out, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'm a federal officer. I'm here looking for 2 missing people. I don't want any trouble." The only response was a low sound that might have been laughter, echoing from multiple directions as if the cave system was playing tricks with acoustics. But I knew better. There was more than one of them. I backed toward the pool, keeping my light moving to prevent anything from approaching unseen. That's when I noticed the pictographs on the walls, ancient symbols painted in what looked like red ochre, depicting human figures and strange, elongated creatures that seemed to dance around primitive fires. My grandfather had shown me similar symbols once, carved into rocks near a sacred site in southeast Alaska. Skinwalkers, he'd called them in English, though the Tlingit word was different, older, carrying implications of transformation and spiritual corruption that English couldn't capture. They were once human, but they chose to become something else, something hungry. The sound of shifting rock came from behind me, and I spun around to see eyes reflecting my headlamp's beam from the darkness of a side passage. Not animal eyes. These held an intelligence that was coldly calculating and utterly malevolent. "What do you want?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. A voice responded from the darkness, speaking in accented English with an odd, lilting quality that made my skin crawl. "The same thing we always want, Ranger. The same thing we took from your friends." "They're alive?" "Parts of them." I raised my pistol, knowing it was probably useless, but needing the comfort of holding something solid and familiar. "Show me where they are." "Oh, we will. But first you need to understand what you're dealing with. Your grandfather knew, didn't he? He told you the old stories." The fact that it knew about my grandfather sent ice water through my veins. I'd never mentioned him to anyone in the Park Service, never talked about his stories or his beliefs. How could this thing know? "You've been watching me," I said. "We've been watching your kind for centuries, learning. Adapting. Your grandfather was wise to stay away from the old places, but you came looking for us." More eyes appeared in the darkness around the chamber, reflecting my light like malevolent stars. I counted at least 6 distinct points of light, meaning I was outnumbered and surrounded. My radio was still producing only static, and my GPS showed no signal this deep underground. "The hikers," I said. "What did you do with them?" "What we do with all trespassers. What we've done for generations when your people venture too far into places they don't belong." One of the creatures moved closer, just to the edge of my light. What I saw made my rational mind rebel against reality. It was roughly human in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, with joints that bent at unnatural angles and skin that looked like it had been stretched over a frame it wasn't designed to fit. The face was the worst part, human features twisted into something predatory and alien. "You have 2 choices, Ranger," it continued in that sing-song voice. "Join your friends in our collection, or leave now and pretend you never found this place." "That's not happening." "I'm not leaving without Marcus and Jennifer." "Then you're not leaving at all." The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. I fired 3 shots at the closest creature, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chamber in stark, terrifying detail. The bullets seemed to have some effect. The thing staggered and retreated, but it didn't go down. I ran for the passage I'd entered through, following my reflective tape markers in a desperate sprint through the narrow tunnels. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, their movements creating an echoing cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cave system worked in their favor, providing multiple routes and hiding places. Several times I had to choose between passages, following my markers by memory. When my headlamp failed to pick them out quickly enough, the sounds of pursuit grew closer with each turn. I reached the main chamber just as my light began to dim. The battery was dying after hours of continuous use. In the growing darkness, I could see the cave entrance ahead, a faint rectangle of starlight that represented safety and sanity. But between me and that exit, silhouetted against the night sky, stood a figure that was definitely human. As I got closer, I recognized the hiking clothes and build. It was Marcus Red, one of the missing hikers. Marcus, I called out, relief flooding through me. Thank God you're alive. We need to get out of here now. He turned toward me, and my relief turned to horror. His face was Marcus Reed's face, but his eyes were wrong, too bright, too knowing, reflecting light like an animal's. When he smiled, his teeth were sharp and gleaming. "Hello, Ranger," he said in that same lilting voice I'd heard from the creature in the chamber. "Going somewhere?" I realized with sick certainty that Marcus Red was gone. Whatever these things were, they could take human form, could wear the faces of their victims like masks. And now they had me trapped between their true forms in the caves and their human disguise at the exit. The battery in my headlamp finally died, plunging me into complete darkness except for the faint starlight from the cave mouth. In that darkness, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps from multiple directions, the rustle of movement that was almost but not quite human. And from somewhere in the darkness, Jennifer Walsh's voice called out, "Help me, please, I'm hurt. I can't move." But I knew it wasn't really Jennifer. Just like Marcus at the cave entrance, it was something else wearing her voice, trying to lure me closer. My grandfather's words echoed in my memory. The forest remembers everything. Every footstep, every breath, every death. These creatures were older than the forest, older than human memory. They had been here when the first people crossed the land bridge from Asia, and they would be here long after the last human was gone. They were the source of every campfire story about things that went bump in the night, every legend about monsters in the woods. And now they had me exactly where they wanted me. I crouched in the absolute darkness of the cave, trying to control my breathing and think through my options. The fake Marcus blocked the main exit, and the creatures were closing in from behind. My pistol had ammunition left, but the bullets hadn't seemed particularly effective against them. I needed a new plan. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had taught me about traditional hunting techniques. When you're outnumbered, he'd said, don't try to fight them all at once. Divide them. Make them come to you one at a time. I pulled out my emergency flare and popped it, bathing the cave in hellish red light. The sudden illumination revealed the true scope of what I was facing. There were at least 8 of them in various stages of transformation, some still mostly human in appearance, others twisted into forms that hurt to look at directly. The flare light seemed to cause them discomfort. They shrank back, shielding their eyes and hissing like angry cats. I used their momentary confusion to sprint toward a side passage I'd noticed earlier, one that led upward toward what I hoped was another exit. Behind me, the fake Marcus called out in his stolen voice, "There's nowhere to run, Ranger. We know these caves better than you know your own home." He was right, but I had advantages too. I was trained in wilderness survival and law enforcement tactics. More importantly, I was fighting for my life while they were just playing with their food. The side passage was steep and narrow, forcing me to climb in some sections. The flare gave me about 15 minutes of light, and I used every second to put distance between myself and my pursuers. The tunnel walls were slick with moisture and heat, making the climb treacherous. About 10 minutes into my ascent, I heard them following. Their movement was different in the narrow space, less coordinated, more constrained by the tunnel walls. This was my chance to even the odds. I found a position where the tunnel made a sharp turn, giving me a clear field of fire down the passage. When the first creature rounded the corner, I put 3 rounds center mass. This time, with the confined space concentrating the impact, the bullets had more effect. The thing went down hard, its inhuman scream echoing through the tunnel system. The others hesitated, and I used their caution to keep climbing. My flare was burning down, casting increasingly dim light, but I could see something ahead that gave me hope. A faint current of cold air that suggested another opening to the surface. The tunnel ended at a narrow crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. I pushed my pack through first, then followed, emerging onto a ledge about halfway up the cliff face that housed the cave system. The night air was shockingly cold after the humid warmth of the tunnels, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever felt. Below me, I could see my original campsite and the lake beyond. Above, the slope continued up to the rim of the volcanic crater. I had options now, room to maneuver and think, but my relief was short-lived. As I made my way down the cliff face using standard rappelling techniques with rope from my pack, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. From the cave entrance below, Jennifer Walsh's voice was calling out again. "Please, I'm really hurt. Marcus is dead. I saw them kill him. Please don't leave me here." The voice was perfect. The right accent, the proper emotional inflection, even what sounded like genuine tears. If I hadn't seen the fake Marcus with my own eyes, I might have believed it. But what was truly disturbing was what this implied. These creatures didn't just kill their victims, they absorbed them somehow, taking not just their appearance but their memories, their speech patterns, their personalities. The real Jennifer Walsh was probably dead, but some essential part of her lived on as a tool for the creatures to use. I reached the bottom of the cliff and began moving toward my campsite, staying low and using the terrain for cover. My plan was to retrieve my emergency beacon and activate it, hoping that the signal would penetrate the volcanic interference and reach park headquarters. So that's when I saw the campfire. Someone had rebuilt my fire and was sitting beside it, silhouetted against the flames. As I got closer, moving carefully from tree to tree, I saw it was a woman with long dark hair wearing hiking clothes. She was singing softly to herself a lullaby that sounded familiar but wrong somehow. "Jennifer," I called out softly. She looked up, and her face was exactly as it appeared in the missing person photos I'd been shown. Young, pretty, with an open, honest expression that made you want to trust her immediately. "Oh, thank God," she said, standing up and moving toward me. "I thought I was going to die out here. They killed Marcus. These things, they're not human. They can change shape, look like people." So everything about her seemed genuine. The relief in her voice, the way she moved, even the small details like the dirt under her fingernails and the tear in her jacket. But I knew it was a lie. I'd seen too much to be fooled by even a perfect imitation. "Stay where you are," I said, drawing my weapon. "Don't come any closer." Her expression changed to confusion, then hurt. "What are you doing? I'm Jennifer Walsh. You're here to rescue me, right?" "Jennifer Walsh is dead," I said, "just like Marcus Red is dead. You're something else wearing her face." For a moment, the mask slipped. Her eyes went cold and calculating, and her smile became something predatory. Then the human facade snapped back into place. "You're mistaken," she said. "I know this is confusing, but I can explain everything. Those things in the caves, they showed me terrible images, made me see things that weren't real. Maybe that's what happened to you too." She was good, better than the others. This one had learned to mimic human psychology as well as appearance. She understood how to manipulate doubt and confusion, how to make someone question their own perceptions. But I remembered my grandfather's final lesson. Trust your instincts, granddaughter. They're older than thought, older than reason. When something feels wrong, it usually is. "Tell me about the wedding ring," I said. "What wedding ring?" "The one Jennifer Walsh wore. It should be on your left hand." The fake Jennifer looked down at her hands, and I saw the moment of realization cross her face. She'd copied everything else perfectly, but she'd missed that small detail. "You're clever," she said, and now her voice carried that same lilting quality I'd heard from the others. Much more clever than the usual prey. "Where are the bodies? The real Marcus and Jennifer?" "Gone. Consumed. They're part of us now, which is why I can wear this shape so perfectly. Every memory, every mannerism, every fear and hope, it all becomes part of the collective. How many of you are there? Enough. We've been here for thousands of years, long before your people crossed the ice bridge. We survived the Great Cold, the volcanic eruptions, the changing of the world. We'll survive long after your species has forgotten how to make fire." As she spoke, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. More figures were emerging from the forest around my campsite, all wearing human faces I didn't recognize. Probably other hikers and hunters who had disappeared over the years, their identities harvested and repurposed. What do you want? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. What we've always wanted: to feed, to grow, to reclaim what was ours before your kind arrived. And you do that by killing people. We do that by becoming people. Each person we absorb makes us stronger, smarter, more capable of blending in with your society. Soon we won't need to hide in caves and hunt in the wilderness. We'll walk among you in your cities, indistinguishable from any other human. The scope of what she was describing hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just monsters hiding in the woods. They were an invasive species with the intelligence and patience to infiltrate human civilization. How many missing persons cases over the years had actually been these creatures expanding their collection of human identities? Your grandfather knew, the fake Jennifer continued. He recognized us for what we were and stayed away from the old places. But you came looking just like all the others. Curiosity is such a human trait. The circle of figures around my campsite was tightening, and I realized I was running out of time. My radio was still producing only static, and even if I could reach headquarters, how could I explain what I'd found? Who would believe such an impossible story? That's when I remembered the emergency flares in my pack. I had 3 left, and while they hadn't seemed to cause permanent damage to the creatures, they had definitely caused discomfort. More importantly, flares were visible from a great distance. If I could get to high ground and set them off, there was a chance someone might see the signal and investigate. I'm going to give you one chance, I said to the fake Jennifer. Let me walk away, and I'll forget I ever found this place. I'll file a report saying the hikers probably fell in the lake or were killed by bears. No one else has to die. She laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Oh, but someone does have to die. You've seen too much, learned too much. You can't be allowed to leave. Then we have a problem. I pulled the pin on my first flare and threw it into the group of figures to my left, then immediately sprinted toward the steep slope that led up to higher ground. Behind me, I heard inhuman screams as the flare burst into brilliant red light. The climb was brutal, made worse by the weight of my pack and the knowledge that they were following close behind. But fear is a powerful motivator. And I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. Every muscle burned, every breath was agony in the thin air, but I kept climbing. About halfway up the slope, I looked back and saw them pursuing. But something was different. They were moving more cautiously now, staying in the shadows whenever possible. The flare had shown me something important. They were vulnerable to bright light, probably adapted to the darkness of their cave system. I reached the rim of the crater just as the first flare burned out below. The view from up there was spectacular. The entire lake spread out beneath me, surrounded by endless wilderness under a canopy of stars. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. I set off my second flare, pointing it straight up to maximize visibility. The red light painted the entire landscape in hellish colors, and I could see the creatures below recoiling from the brightness. This was my chance. I activated my emergency beacon and started the long descent down the far side of the crater, away from the cave system and toward the ranger station. If I could reach my radio equipment there, I might be able to call for help. More importantly, the station had weapons and supplies that could help me survive until rescue arrived. But as I made my way through the darkness, using my remaining flare sparingly to navigate the treacherous terrain, I realized that rescue might not be enough. These creatures had been killing people for generations, maybe centuries. They were patient, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless. Stopping them would require more than just surviving the night. It would require making people believe the impossible and finding a way to fight an enemy that could wear any face, tell any lie, and had all the time in the world to plan their next move. The forest around me was silent except for the sound of my own footsteps and labored breathing. But I knew they were out there, following, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hunt was far from over. I reached my ranger station just before dawn, exhausted and running on nothing but adrenaline and fear. The familiar sight of the small log cabin sitting beside Naknek Lake should have been comforting, but something felt wrong. The windows were dark, which was normal, but there was no smoke from the chimney despite the morning chill. More disturbing was the complete absence of wildlife around the station. Usually I'd see ravens, ground squirrels, maybe a fox or two. The area was popular with animals because I kept it clean and food secure. But this morning, it was as if every living creature had fled. I approached carefully, my pistol drawn and my last flare ready. The front door was ajar, which sent warning signals through my tired mind. I always locked the station when I left, a habit ingrained through years of wilderness living where bears and other animals might otherwise make themselves at home. Inside, the cabin was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and my radio equipment was smashed beyond repair. But what caught my attention were the footprints in the dust, the same oversized, wrong-shaped prints I'd found near the cave system. They'd been here. They'd been here. Probably while I was searching for the missing hikers, they'd come to my station and disabled my communications. This wasn't random predation. It was a coordinated effort to isolate me. I gathered what supplies I could salvage: ammunition, food, my backup GPS unit, and a small camping stove. My emergency cache was hidden under the floorboards, and thankfully it was untouched. Inside I found additional flares, a satellite phone with limited battery life, and something my grandfather had given me years ago, a small pouch of what he'd called old medicine. For the worst kind of trouble, he'd told me when he pressed it into my hands, when the things that shouldn't exist won't stay dead. I'd never opened the pouch, never really believed I'd need to. But as I held it now, feeling the weight of whatever was inside, I remembered the fear in my grandfather's eyes when he'd given it to me. He'd known this day might come. The satellite phone had enough power for one call, maybe two if I kept them short. I dialed park headquarters, praying for a clear connection. Katmai dispatch. This is Ranger Station 7. Emergency situation. Request immediate helicopter evacuation and backup. Multiple fatalities in the backcountry. Repeat, multiple fatalities, an officer in distress. The response was broken by static, but I caught enough to understand that help was on the way. Weather was marginal for flying, but they'd get a team to me as soon as possible. Vita approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. I had to survive 4 more hours against creatures that could look like anyone, move like shadows, and had every advantage except one. They didn't know about my grandfather's medicine. I opened the pouch carefully. Inside was a fine powder that smelled like sage and cedar, along with something else I couldn't identify. There was also a small piece of paper with instructions written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, in the Tlingit language I'd learned as a child. The instructions were simple, but specific. The powder was to be burned, creating smoke that would reveal the true nature of shapeshifters and make them vulnerable to conventional weapons. But it came with warnings. Use sparingly, as the supply was limited. Don't breathe the smoke directly, as it could cause hallucinations in humans. And most importantly, once used, there was no going back. The creatures would know I had access to the old knowledge and would never stop hunting me. I was reading the instructions when I heard a voice calling from outside. Hello? Is anyone there? I need help. The voice was male, middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. Through the window, I could see a man in hiking gear standing near the lake shore. He looked exhausted and frightened, exactly like someone who'd been lost in the wilderness for days. But I'd learned not to trust appearances. Stay where you are, I called back. I'm a park ranger. I'll come out to help you. I prepared a small amount of the powder in my camping stove, ready to light it if necessary. Then I stepped outside, keeping my weapon ready, but not obviously threatening. Thank God, the man said, relief evident in his voice. I've been lost for 3 days. My GPS died, and I ran out of food. I saw the smoke from your chimney and knew someone must be here. What's your name? I asked. David Kowalski. I'm from Houston. I was supposed to meet my brother at the lodge, but I took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up completely turned around. Everything about his story sounded plausible. His gear looked authentic. He had the right kind of wear patterns on his boots, and his accent was consistent. But something in his eyes reminded me of the fake Jennifer, too bright, too knowing. Can you show me some identification? I asked. He reached for his wallet, and I saw his hand shake slightly. The license looked genuine, Texas issue, proper holographic security features, photo that matched his face. David Kowalski, age 47, Houston address. If this was a fake, it was an incredibly sophisticated one. How did you get lost? I asked, watching his reactions carefully. I was hiking the backcountry trail near the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Beautiful country, but I guess I underestimated how easy it is to lose your way out here. I've been following water sources, hoping to find civilization. He knew the right terminology, the right geographical references. Either he was telling the truth or these creatures were even more dangerous than I'd realized. Have you seen anyone else out there? A man and woman, probably in their 20s. His expression darkened. Actually, yes. I found their campsite 2 days ago. It was bad. Looked like animals had gotten to them. I didn't find any bodies, just blood and torn clothing. This was information only someone who'd actually been to the cave area would know. But it was also exactly what one of the creatures would say if they'd absorbed the memories of someone who'd witnessed the attack. I made my decision and lit the powder in my camping stove. The smoke that rose from the mixture was unlike anything I'd ever seen, thick and white with an almost oily consistency that seemed to hang in the air rather than dispersing naturally. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burning herbs and something else that made my eyes water. David Kowalski's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His skin began to ripple and shift like water disturbed by wind. The human features I'd been looking at melted and reformed, revealing something that was fundamentally other. The creature that emerged was tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and a face that was almost human but wrong in every proportion. "Clever girl," it said in a voice that was no longer David Kowalski's. "Your grandfather taught you well. I put 3 rounds center mass, and this time the bullets had their intended effect." The creature went down hard, black fluid leaking from the wounds, but even as it died, it was laughing. "You think you've won something," it gasped. "But we are legion. We have walked among your people for generations, wearing their faces, learning their ways. Soon we won't need to hunt in the wilderness anymore. How many of you are there? More than you can imagine. And now that you've used the old medicine, they'll all know about you. You'll never be safe again." The creature's form began to dissolve, breaking down into something that looked like ash mixed with organic matter. Within minutes, there was nothing left but a stain on the ground and the lingering smell of corruption. I spent the next 3 hours preparing for what I knew would be the final confrontation. They would come for me before the rescue helicopter arrived. The dying creature had made that clear. But now I had weapons that could hurt them, and I intended to use every advantage I could get. I scattered the remaining powder around the perimeter of the station, creating a defensive barrier that would reveal any approaching shapeshifters. I set up additional flares as perimeter alarms, positioned to give me maximum warning of any approach, and I loaded every weapon I had with the ammunition most likely to stop them. Just after noon, my preparations were put to the test. They came from multiple directions simultaneously, wearing faces I recognized from missing person reports dating back years. Men, women, even children, all moving with the same fluid, inhuman grace that marked them as predators rather than prey. The powder smoke revealed their true nature as they crossed my defensive perimeter, stripping away their human disguises to show the monsters beneath. Some were more human than others, suggesting they were newer acquisitions. Others had been transformed so long that barely any human characteristics remained. The battle was brief but vicious. My weapons were effective now, each shot dropping one of the creatures permanently. But they were fast and coordinated, attacking from unexpected angles and using tactics that suggested a hive-mind intelligence. I was down to my last magazine when I heard the sound I'd been praying for, the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of helicopter rotors approaching across the lake. The cavalry was finally arriving, but as the rescue helicopter settled onto the shore near my station, I realized my ordeal was far from over. The creatures I'd killed were just the beginning. Somewhere out there were others, probably hundreds of them, wearing human faces and living human lives while they planned the next phase of their invasion. The pilot who stepped out of the helicopter looked familiar, and it took me a moment to recognize him as Jack Morrison, a veteran pilot I'd worked with on previous rescues. But after everything I'd been through, I couldn't take anything at face value. "Ayana," he called out. "We got your distress call. Are you injured?" I kept my distance and lit another small portion of the powder. The smoke revealed Jack Morrison exactly as he should be. Human, tired, concerned about my welfare. No shape-shifting, no inhuman characteristics. Thank God, I said, finally allowing myself to feel a moment of relief. But as we loaded my gear into the helicopter and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The creatures had mentioned walking among humans in cities, infiltrating civilization itself. How many missing persons cases over the years had actually been these things expanding their collection of identities? And more importantly, how could anyone fight an enemy that could look like anyone, be anyone, and had the patience of centuries to plan their moves? Yuaki, their Mugre. As we lifted off from the lake and headed towards civilization, I clutched my grandfather's medicine pouch and tried to figure out how to explain the impossible to people who would never believe it. The war between humans and something far older had just begun, and I was the only one who knew it was happening. 3 weeks after my rescue, I sat in a sterile conference room at Park Service headquarters in Anchorage, facing a panel of officials who looked at me like I'd suffered a complete psychological breakdown. The official report I'd filed had been classified and buried so deep that I doubted anyone would ever see it again. Ranger Crowfeather, said Regional Director Patricia Hayes, her voice carefully neutral, we understand you've been through a traumatic experience. The loss of 2 hikers under your watch, the isolation, the stress, it's not uncommon for personnel to experience. Unusual perceptions under such circumstances. Unusual perceptions, that's what they were calling it. I know how it sounds, I said for the 100th time. But I have physical evidence. The photographs, the GPS coordinates, the photographs show what appear to be bear tracks and natural cave formations. Interrupted Dr. Michael Brennan, the staff psychologist they'd assigned to my case. Your GPS data confirms you were in a known geothermal area where cave systems and hot springs are common. None of this supports your claims about, what did you call them? Shapeshifters? I looked around the table at their carefully composed faces. Hayes Brennan, Assistant Director Robert Chen, and 2 other officials whose names I'd already forgotten. All of them intelligent, dedicated people who were trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into their worldview. What about the missing hikers? Marcus Red and Jennifer Walsh? You found no trace of them. Alaska wilderness is unforgiving, Hayes replied. People disappear without a trace every year. Usually it's exposure, animal attacks, or simple misadventure. Rarely do we recover bodies in terrain like that. And my radio equipment, someone destroyed it. Bears are known to break into ranger stations. They can cause extensive damage when they smell food or investigate unfamiliar objects. They had an answer for everything. A rational explanation that didn't require them to believe in monsters. I couldn't blame them. If someone had told me this story 3 weeks ago, I would have recommended psychological evaluation too. What happens now? I asked. Dr. Brennan leaned forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. We're recommending you take extended medical leave. Get some rest. Work with a therapist to process what you've experienced. When you're ready, there are other positions available, visitor center work, administrative roles, maybe something closer to civilization. You're taking me off backcountry duty. For now, yes, we have to consider public safety as well as your own well-being. Public safety, if only they knew. I accepted their recommendations because I had no choice. Fighting them would only reinforce their belief that I was unstable. But as I cleaned out my office and prepared to leave headquarters, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I was going to find the truth, whatever it cost me. The research began that night in my small apartment in Anchorage. I started with missing persons reports from Alaska over the past 20 years, cross-referencing them with locations near known cave systems and geothermal areas. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Over 200 people had vanished without a trace in areas that matched the geological profile of where I'd encountered the creatures. Most were hikers, hunters, or researchers working alone or in small groups. The disappearances were scattered across time and location, never enough in one place to attract serious attention. But when mapped together, they formed a clear pattern centered on areas of volcanic activity and natural cave systems throughout Alaska and Western Canada. I expanded my search to include Native American folklore from the region, The stories were remarkably consistent across different tribes and linguistic groups: shapeshifters that lived in the earth, creatures that could wear human faces, spirits that fed on human essence. My grandfather's people, the Tlingit, had dozens of stories about such entities. The Inuit called them adlevan, things that lived beneath the ice and stone. The Athabascan people spoke of nogloshii, a word that was usually translated as skinwalker but carried implications far more sinister than the English term conveyed. All of these stories shared common elements. The creatures were ancient, predatory, and capable of perfect human mimicry. They lived in hidden places beneath the earth and emerged to hunt when humans ventured too far into the wilderness. And in every tradition, there were rituals and substances that could reveal their true nature. Old medicine, like what my grandfather had given me. But folklore wasn't evidence, at least not the kind that would convince authorities to take action. I needed something more concrete. That's when I found Dr. Amanda Ross. Dr. Ross was an anthropologist at the University of Alaska who specialized in indigenous folklore and its relationship to unexplained phenomena. Her published papers were academic and cautious, but her personal blog was different. There, she wrote about cases that didn't fit conventional explanations, mysteries that suggested there might be truth behind some of the old stories. I contacted her through encrypted email, using techniques I'd learned in federal law enforcement training. Our first meeting was at a coffee shop in downtown Anchorage, both of us nervous and uncertain about what we were getting into. "I've been researching cases like yours for 15 years, she said after I told her my story. "Not just in Alaska, but across North America. The pattern is consistent. Missing persons in remote areas, usually near geological formations that could hide large cave systems. Do you believe they're real?" "I believe something is happening that doesn't fit our current understanding of the world. Whether that's unknown predatory animals, human criminals using sophisticated disguise techniques, or something else entirely, I'm not sure it matters. People are disappearing and the authorities aren't taking it seriously." She showed me files on similar cases from Montana, Wyoming, and northern Canada. In each area, there were clusters of unexplained disappearances near cave systems, often accompanied by reports of unusual wildlife behavior or strange sounds from local residents. "The question is, what do we do about it?" she asked. "We find more evidence. Document everything. Build a case that's too strong to ignore. That could take years. How many more people will disappear while we're gathering proof?" It was a good question, one that kept me awake at night. But rushing ahead without solid evidence would just get us dismissed as cranks or conspiracy theorists. Over the following months, Dr. Ross and I developed a network of contacts. Park rangers, indigenous elders, researchers, and amateur investigators who were tracking similar phenomena. We shared information through secure channels and slowly built a database of incidents that painted a disturbing picture. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to be expanding their range. Disappearances that had once been confined to the most remote wilderness areas were now occurring closer to populated regions. It was as if they were growing bolder, more confident in their ability to operate undetected. But we also found evidence of resistance. Several indigenous communities had detailed protocols for dealing with shapeshifter encounters, passed down through generations of oral tradition. These protocols included specific herbs and substances that could reveal the creature's true nature, as well as weapons and tactics that were effective against them. My grandfather's medicine pouch hadn't been unique. It was part of a larger tradition of preparation for a threat that most of the modern world had forgotten about. 6 months after my encounter at the cave system, Dr. Ross and I decided it was time to return to the scene. We needed physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. More importantly, we needed to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with. The expedition was carefully planned and heavily equipped. In addition to Dr. Ross and myself, we brought along Jake Harrison, a former military combat photographer who specialized in documenting dangerous situations, and Maria Santos, a geologist who could help us understand the cave system's structure and extent. We entered the caves at night using thermal imaging equipment to detect any warm-blooded presence. The bone pile I'd found was gone. But we discovered something even more disturbing. A series of chambers carved deep into the rock, filled with what looked like ceremonial objects and human artifacts dating back decades. Dr. Ross identified some of the symbols carved into the chamber walls as pre-Columbian in origin, but mixed with elements that didn't match any known Native American culture. It was as if the creatures had been influencing human settlements for centuries, leaving traces of their presence in the archaeological record. We documented everything we could before retreating to the surface. The evidence we gathered was compelling. Photographs, video recordings, geological samples, and artifacts that would be difficult to explain through conventional means. But as we prepared to leave the area, we discovered we weren't alone. Jake's thermal imaging picked up movement in the forest around our campsite, multiple heat signatures moving with coordinated precision. They were being watched, probably had been since we'd entered the cave system. "We need to leave now," I said, remembering what had happened to Marcus and Jennifer. But it was too late. They emerged from the tree line wearing faces I recognized from missing persons reports, moving with that fluid grace that marked them as something other than human. There were at least a dozen of them, more than we could possibly fight. That's when Dr. Ross revealed something she hadn't told us before. She pulled out a small device that looked like a modified emergency beacon and activated it. Immediately, the creatures stopped their advance, showing signs of distress similar to what I'd seen when I used my grandfather's medicine. "Ultrasonic frequency generator," she explained as we quickly broke camp. "I've been working on it for months based on descriptions of traditional sound-based deterrents mentioned in the folklore. The device bought us time to reach our vehicles and escape, but I knew this was just a temporary heave. The creatures now knew that humans were actively investigating them, developing countermeasures. They would adapt just as they'd been adapting for centuries. As we drove back toward civilization, Dr. Ross made a decision that changed everything. "We're going public," she said. "Full disclosure, all the evidence, everything we've learned. They'll destroy our credibility, call us crazy, maybe, but people have a right to know what's out there. And maybe, just maybe, someone in authority will listen." The press conference took place a week later at the University of Alaska. We presented our findings to a room full of skeptical journalists, Park Service officials, and academics. The reaction was exactly what we'd expected: polite dismissal mixed with thinly veiled concern for our mental health. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Other people began coming forward with similar stories. Hikers who'd had strange encounters, hunters who'd seen things that didn't make sense, indigenous elders who'd been waiting for someone to take the old stories seriously. More importantly, the disappearances stopped. For 3 months after our press conference, there were no unexplained vanishings in the areas we'd identified as creature habitat. It was as if our public revelation had forced them to retreat deeper underground, to reconsider their strategy. But I knew it was only temporary. Creatures that had survived for millennia wouldn't be deterred by media attention for long. They would adapt, find new ways to hunt, develop countermeasures to our countermeasures. The war between humans and something far older was just beginning, and most people still didn't know it was happening. As I write this, it's been 2 years since my encounter at the cave system. I work now as a consultant, helping other investigators track unusual disappearances and developing protocols for wilderness safety that go beyond conventional wisdom. Dr. Ross and I continue our research, supported by a small but growing network of people who understand the truth. The creatures are still out there. They're more careful now, more selective in their hunting, but they haven't gone away. Recent reports suggest they may be adapting to urban environments, learning to operate in populated areas where their shape-shifting abilities would be even more effective. My grandfather was right about one thing: the forest remembers everything, every footstep, every breath, every death. But humans have something the creatures don't expect: the ability to remember too, to learn from the past and prepare for the future. The old knowledge isn't lost. It's just been sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up. And now that it's awake, the real fight can begin. Most people just call me Ray. I've spent most of my life working as a park ranger, though that wasn't the plan originally. I was supposed to be a school teacher, settle down with my wife in a cozy little town. But life has a funny way of steering you off course, and here I am with a rifle in my hand and the endless wilderness as my backyard. The woods have been my home for years now. The marriage fell apart 3 years ago. The years ago. Sarah said I'd become distant, that I cared more about the trees than I did about her. Maybe she was right. After the divorce, I threw myself deeper into the work, spending weeks at a time in the backcountry, checking trail markers and monitoring wildlife patterns. The solitude suited me. Out here, surrounded by oak and maple, with nothing but the sound of wind through branches and the occasional call of a red-tailed hawk, I could think clearly. Or maybe I could stop thinking altogether. Eagle Creek State Park sprawls across 12,000 acres of rugged Illinois wilderness, a place where Chicago might as well be on another planet. We're not exactly a tourist hotspot. Most people drive through on their way to more glamorous destinations. But for those who appreciate raw nature, thick forests, and the kind of quiet that makes city folk uncomfortable, it's paradise. The park gets its name from the creek that winds through the center, though I haven't seen an eagle here in over a decade. Development pressure pushed them out long before I arrived. My station sits at the eastern edge of the park, a modest log structure that serves as both office and living quarters. Solar panels power the basic electronics, and a satellite phone connects me to the outside world when weather permits. Most days, I prefer the radio silence. The nearest town, Millbrook, population 847, lies 15 miles away down a gravel road that turns to mud when it rains. I make the trip once a week for supplies, and that's usually more human contact than I need. The work itself is straightforward. Maintain trails, monitor campgrounds, assist lost hikers, and keep an eye out for poachers. In 12 years, I've handled 2 bear encounters, countless snake bites on careless campers, and one memorable incident involving a drunk college student who thought it would be funny to feed a wild boar. Nature has a way of teaching hard lessons to those who don't listen. But the last couple of weeks had felt different. It started with small things, a strange quietness in sections of forest that should have been full of birdsong, scratch marks on trees that didn't match any animal I knew, and an odd smell in certain areas, like wet concrete mixed with something metallic. I'd mentioned it to Dale O'Connor, my supervisor, during one of our weekly check-ins, but he'd attributed it to seasonal changes. "You spend too much time alone out there, Ray," he'd said with his usual mixture of concern and exasperation. "Maybe it's time to take some leave. Then came the reports of missing people. The first were 2 college kids from Northwestern, Jake Morrison and Lisa Chen, who'd come out for a weekend camping trip. Their families reported them missing when they failed to return to campus on Monday. We found their campsite intact, tent still standing, food hung properly to avoid bears, no signs of struggle. Their car keys were in Jake's backpack, wallets untouched. It was as if they'd simply vanished into the air. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days. Volunteers from 3 counties combed through miles of forest, calling their names until their voices went hoarse. Dogs picked up their scent, leading away from camp toward the deep woods, then lost it completely at a rocky outcropping near Eagle Creek itself. The trail just ended as if they'd sprouted wings and flown away. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Marcus Webb, a 52-year-old accountant from Chicago with 20 years of hiking experience, had planned a solo backpacking trip along the Ridgeline Trail. His wife grew worried when he missed their scheduled check-in call on Saturday evening. We found his car in the parking area, gear laid out methodically beside it. Marcus was the type who planned everything down to the last energy bar. His GPS showed he'd made it about 6 miles into the backcountry before the signal cut out. The second search effort was larger, more systematic. State police brought in helicopters, and we had teams of volunteers working in grid patterns across the entire eastern section of the park. I spent 18 hours a day in the field, following every possible trail, checking every cave and ravine where someone might have taken shelter. We found nothing. No torn clothing, no abandoned equipment, no blood. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. The third disappearance shook me more than I wanted to admit. The Hendricks family, David, his wife Karen, and their 2 children, Tommy, age 8, and Sarah, age 5, had reserved campsite 12 for a long weekend. They were experienced campers who visited Eagle Creek twice a year, always following safety protocols to the letter. David was a paramedic. Karen taught elementary school. They knew how to handle themselves outdoors. When they failed to check out on Monday morning, I drove to their site personally. The scene was eerily similar to the others. Everything in place, no signs of disturbance. But this time, there were details that made my skin crawl. Tommy's favorite stuffed dinosaur sat on a camp chair, positioned as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Karen's coffee mug was still warm. Most disturbing of all, little Sarah's coloring book lay open to a page where she'd been drawing her family. The crayon marks looked fresh, the waxy smell still strong in the morning air. That night, I called Dale from my station, pacing the small office while I talked. 3 separate incidents, Dale. This isn't random. There's a pattern here. What kind of pattern? His voice crackled through the satellite connection. I don't know yet, but something's wrong. Really wrong. The disappearance sites are all within a 5-mile radius, all in the same general area of the park. Have you considered that maybe they just got lost, disoriented? You know how easy it is for people to wander off trail, and these weren't inexperienced hikers, I interrupted. The college kids, maybe, but Marcus Webb, the Hendricks family? They knew these woods almost as well as I do. A long pause. What are you suggesting, Ray? I stared out the window at the tree line, visible in the glow of my porch light. Something moved between the trunks, just at the edge of vision, but when I focused on it, nothing was there. I think we need more people out here. A real investigation, not just search and rescue. Dale sighed. I'll see what I can do. Ray? Maybe you should consider that assignment in the state office. Get away from the woods for a while. Clear your head. After I hung up, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Owls calling to each other across the darkness, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant trickle of Eagle Creek over stones. Normal sounds, comforting sounds, comforting sounds. But underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else. A low humming, so faint it might have been my imagination, like the sound of electrical lines in a storm. I'd grown up in these woods, knew every trail and landmark for miles in any direction. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never felt afraid of the forest at night. But sitting there in the darkness, with the unknown fate of 7 people weighing on my mind, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The primitive fear of things that hunt in the dark. The next morning brought unseasonably heavy fog that rolled through the valleys like smoke, reducing visibility to just a few yards. I spent the day checking remote areas where the missing people might have taken shelter, calling their names into the mist, and hearing only my own voice echo back. By afternoon, the fog began to lift, and that's when I saw them. Tracks in the soft earth near Eagle Creek, about 2 miles from the Hendricks campsite. They were unlike anything I'd seen before. Roughly humanoid, but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The stride length suggested something tall, maybe 7 feet or more. Most disturbing was how they seemed to change as they crossed different types of terrain. Whoa. On hard ground, they looked almost human. In soft mud, they showed those impossible proportions. It was as if whatever made them could somehow alter its gait, its very anatomy, depending on the surface. I photographed the tracks from every angle, then followed them as far as I could. They led deeper into the forest, toward an area locals called the Hollow, a depression in the landscape where the trees grew thicker and older, their canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The tracks disappeared at the edge of a rocky stream bed, leaving me staring into the green shadows of the hollow with a growing sense that something was staring back. That evening, Dale called with news that would change everything. "I'm sending you some help," he said without preamble. 2 rangers from downstate, experienced guys who've dealt with unusual situations before. They'll be there tomorrow morning. What kind of unusual situations? The kind where people go missing and don't turn up again. Greg Walters and Sam Blackwell. Greg's ex-military, special forces, and Sam's got degrees in forestry and criminal psychology. Between the 2 of them, they should be able to figure out what's happening in your park. After the call, I stood on my porch again, looking out at the forest. The humming sound was stronger tonight, more noticeable, and I could see what looked like a faint glow emanating from the direction of the hollow. probably phosphorescence from rotting wood, I told myself, or maybe swamp gas. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something was living in my forest, something that took people and left no trace. And tomorrow, I'd have to lead two strangers into its territory, pretending I knew what we were up against. The last thing I remember from that night was the sound of footsteps circling my station, slow and deliberate, never quite close enough to see clearly. When I stepped outside with my flashlight, the footsteps stopped. When I went back inside, they resumed. I spent the night awake in a chair by the window, rifle across my lap, watching the tree line and wondering what was watching me back. Greg Walters and Sam Blackwell arrived at Eagle Creek just after dawn, driving a dusty Park Service truck that looked like it had seen better days. I watched them unload their gear from my porch, coffee mug in hand, sizing them up the way you do with new partners in a dangerous job. Greg was exactly what Dale had described, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that screamed military background. His hair was cut short, graying at the temples, and his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare I'd seen in other veterans. He moved with economical precision, every motion purposeful. When he looked at the forest, it was with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to spot threats in hostile territory. Sam was his opposite in almost every way. Shorter, slighter, with the pale complexion of someone who spent more time indoors than out. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried himself with the careful movements of an academic. But there was something in his eyes, a sharp intelligence that suggested he saw patterns where others saw chaos. "You must be Callahan," Greg said, extending a hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Dale told us about the situation. 7 people missing, no bodies, no leads. That's about the size of it," I replied, leading them inside. "Coffee?" Leading them inside. While I poured, Sam studied the wall map of Eagle Creek, marking the disappearance sites with colored pins. "Interesting pattern," he murmured. "All within this eastern quadrant, roughly 5 miles from your station. You noticed that too." "It's textbook territory behavior," Sam continued, adjusting his glasses. "If we were dealing with a large predator, mountain lion, bear, even a feral dog pack, they'd establish a hunting ground and stick to it. But the lack of remains suggests something else." Greg examined the photographs I'd taken of the strange tracks. "These are unusual, almost human, but the proportions are wrong. Could be someone in modified boots trying to throw off investigators." "Someone?" I asked. "Serial killer, maybe. Someone who knows these woods, has a base of operations out here. It wouldn't be the first time a murderer used wilderness areas to dispose of bodies." Sam shook his head. "The pattern's wrong for a human predator. Too methodical, too clean, and these tracks..." He picked up one of the photos, studying it closely. The depth and spacing suggests something much larger than a normal person. Either someone in an elaborate costume or what? I'm not sure yet. We need to see the sites firsthand. I led them to the Hendricks campsite first, now stripped of the family's belongings but still bearing the invisible weight of their disappearance. Greg examined the area with military thoroughness, checking sightlines and escape routes, while Sam focused on more subtle details. "The positioning's deliberate," Sam observed, crouching near the fire ring. "Look at how the chairs are arranged, the way the tent's oriented. It's almost ceremonial." "What do you mean?" "Someone or something arranged this scene after the family disappeared. This isn't how people naturally set up a campsite for the night." Greg had wandered to the edge of the clearing, his attention caught by something in the trees. "Ray, come look at this." About 15 feet into the forest, carved into the bark of an old oak, were marks I'd somehow missed during previous searches. They weren't random scratches. There was a pattern to them, symbols that almost looked like writing, but in no alphabet I recognized. "Fresh," Greg said, running his finger along the gouges. "Made within the last week or 2. Sam photographed the markings from multiple angles. Territorial markers, maybe. Some large predators mark trees to define their hunting grounds. With symbols, with whatever works. We're dealing with something intelligent, Ray. Something that understands the concept of communication." We spent the morning visiting each disappearance site, and the pattern became clearer with each location. All showed signs of post-incident manipulation, items moved, scenes staged, and always those strange symbols carved nearby. But it was at Marcus Webb's last known position that we found something truly disturbing. The GPS coordinates led us to a rocky outcropping overlooking Eagle Creek, where the trail curved sharply around a granite face. Marcus's footprints were clearly visible in the soft earth leading up to the rocks, but they simply ended at the edge of a small cliff, not high enough to cause serious injury, maybe 8 feet down to the creek bed below. He didn't fall, Greg said, studying the edge. Keg studying the edge. No scuff marks, no signs of a struggle. It's like he just stepped off into thin air. Sam was examining the rock face itself, running his hands over the granite surface. There's something here, he called. Ray, bring that flashlight. What he'd found chilled me to the bone. Chilled me to the bone. Carved into the rock, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was another of those symbol sequences. But this one was different. Longer, more complex, and still fresh enough that granite dust covered the ground below it. It's a message, Sam said quietly. I'm sure of it. But what it says. We need to document everything, Greg interrupted. Map all the disappearance sites, catalog every symbol, build a profile of whatever we're dealing with. That afternoon, we returned to my station to analyze what we'd found. Sam spread the photographs across my kitchen table, arranging them by site and symbol type, while Greg cleaned his rifle with the methodical care of someone who expected to use it soon. It's territorial behavior, Sam concluded after an hour of study. But more sophisticated than any animal I've encountered. These symbols aren't random. They're getting more complex, more elaborate. Whatever's making them is learning, adapting. Learning what? How to communicate with us, maybe. Or how to hunt us more effectively. The conversation was interrupted by a radio call from Dale. 2 more hikers, a married couple from Rockford, had failed to return from a day hike on the western ridge. Their car was still in the parking area. Keys locked inside, no sign of where they'd gone. That's 9 people, I said after signing off. 9 people in 3 weeks. Greg was already gathering his gear. We need to get out there before dark, see if we can pick up their trail while it's still fresh. The Western Ridge was a 3-mile hike from my station, following a well-maintained trail that offered spectacular views of the surrounding forest. The missing couple, Janet and Robert Kowalski, both in their 50s, were experienced hikers who'd visited Eagle Creek dozens of times over the years. Their disappearance from such a popular trail suggested our unknown predator was becoming bolder. We found their day packs about 2 miles up the trail, abandoned beside a scenic overlook where they'd apparently stopped for lunch. Janet's water bottle was still half full, and Robert's camera contained photos taken just hours earlier, normal vacation shots of forest views and wildlife. But it was the final photo that made my blood run cold. Robert had apparently been photographing the valley below when something caught his attention. The camera's automatic timestamp showed the image was taken at 2:47 p.m., less than 3 hours ago. In the foreground was the expected vista of trees and hills, but in the background, barely visible among the shadows, was a shape that shouldn't have been there. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to be standing upright among the trees about a quarter-mile away. The image was blurry, probably taken as Robert turned the camera quickly, but there was something about the proportions that made it clearly inhuman, and it appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Jesus, Greg breathed, studying the image on the camera's small screen. What the hell is that thing? Before anyone could answer, we heard it. That low, resonant humming sound I'd been noticing for weeks, but much louder now, coming from the forest below us. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, through the trees, through our very bones. Sam pulled out a small recording device, hands shaking slightly as he activated it. We need to document this, he whispered. The humming continued for maybe 30 seconds, rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost musical. And then impossibly we heard something else mixed in with it. Voices. Human voices calling for help, screaming in terror and pain. Janet's voice. Help us. Someone help us. Robert's voice. It's got Janet. Oh God, it's got her. And underneath it all, a sound that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, something between a growl and laughter. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We stood frozen on that overlook for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, straining to hear any other sound, any sign of the missing couple. But there was nothing. No bird song, no insect noise, no wind through the trees. Just that oppressive quiet that made every heartbeat sound like thunder. We need to get out of here, Greg said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Now. But as we turned to leave, Sam grabbed my arm. Ray, look at the trees. In the fading afternoon light, something was moving through the forest below us. Not one thing, but several, flowing between the trunks with that same fluid grace I'd glimpsed outside my station. They were too far away to make out details, but their movement was coordinated, purposeful. They were hunting. Run, I said. We ran, the 3-mile hike back to my station passed in a blur of pounding footsteps and ragged breathing. Every shadow seemed to hide something watching us. Every rustle in the undergrowth could have been pursuit. Greg set a punishing pace, his military training taking over, while Sam and I struggled to keep up. We didn't stop running until we reached the station, slamming the door behind us and checking every window, every possible entry point. Only then did we allow ourselves to process what we'd experienced. Those voices, Sam said, collapsing into a chair. That was Janet and Robert Kowalski. I'd stake my life on it. But how? Greg demanded. How could we hear them from that distance? And mixed in with that sound? I thought about the humming I'd been hearing for weeks, about the footsteps circling my station at night, about the growing feeling that something in the forest was learning, adapting, preparing. It's mimicking them, I said. Whatever took the Kowalskis, it's using their voices as bait. Sam nodded grimly. Vocal mimicry isn't uncommon in nature. Mockingbirds, parrots, even some predators use it to lure prey. But this level of sophistication... This isn't some animal, Greg interrupted. Animals don't carve symbols into trees, they don't stage crime scenes. We're dealing with something else entirely. As if in response to his words, the humming started again, closer now, coming from just outside the station. We turned off the lights and peered through the windows, but the forest looked empty in the moonlight. The humming grew louder, more complex, and suddenly we could hear voices again. All of them, Jake and Lisa, calling for help. Marcus Webb screaming in pain. The Hendricks children crying for their parents. It was a chorus of the dead and disappeared, broadcast from the darkness by something that had learned to use human suffering as a weapon. But this time, there was something new mixed in with the familiar voices. Janet and Robert Kowalski, pleading for rescue, describing in horrific detail what was being done to them in some unseen place deep in the forest. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakably present, was another sound, something that might have been laughter, if laughter could be stripped of all warmth and humanity, and turned into an expression of pure malevolence. The sounds continued until dawn, circling the station like a pack of wolves, testing our defenses, learning our weaknesses. By morning, we were exhausted, demoralized, and facing a terrible truth. Whatever was hunting in Eagle Creek wasn't just killing people. It was collecting them, just collecting them. Dawn brought no relief from the night's torment. The unnatural chorus had finally stopped with the first rays of sunlight, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the voices themselves. Greg hadn't slept at all, spending the night moving from window to window with his rifle, while Sam had tried to make sense of his recordings using my laptop. I dozed fitfully in my chair, waking every few minutes to the phantom sound of footsteps on my porch. "Finalize the audio," Sam announced over coffee that tasted like mud. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes. The vocal patterns are perfect matches to the missing people, not just similar, but exact duplicates down to speech patterns and regional accents. How is that possible? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Perfect pitch memory coupled with advanced vocal mimicry. Some animals can do it, but not to this degree of sophistication. Whatever we're dealing with, it's been listening to these people long enough to perfectly reproduce their voices. Greg looked up from cleaning his rifle for the third time that morning. Listening to them where and for how long? That's the question, isn't it? Sam pushed his glasses up his nose. For this level of accuracy, it would need extended exposure. Hours, maybe days. The implication hung in the air like smoke. The missing people weren't just dead. They'd been kept alive long enough for something to study them, to learn their voices, their mannerisms, their fears. We need to find where it's keeping them, I said. Kept, Greg corrected grimly, past tense. Those recordings last night, some of those people have been missing for weeks. A radio call interrupted our grim breakfast. Dale's voice crackled through the static, urgent and stressed. Ray, we've got another situation. State police found two bodies about 10 miles south of your position, just outside park boundaries. They want a ranger on scene for consultation. My stomach dropped. Who? Still waiting on identification, but Ray. These weren't normal deaths. You need to see this. The drive to the crime scene took us through unfamiliar territory south of Eagle Creek, along logging roads that barely qualified as paths. Greg navigated while I wrestled with questions that had no good answers. After weeks of disappearances without a trace, why were we suddenly finding bodies? And why outside the park? The answer became clear as soon as we arrived at the scene. Two Illinois State Police cruisers were parked beside a small clearing where Detective Maria Santos, a woman I'd worked with on previous cases, was supervising a team of technicians. Her usually composed expression was strained as she approached our vehicle. Ray, thank God you're here. We need someone who knows the local wildlife patterns because what we found, she gestured toward the clearing. It doesn't make sense. The bodies were arranged in the center of the clearing with disturbing precision. Jake Morrison and Lisa Chen, the first two missing hikers, were positioned sitting upright against a fallen log, their hands folded in their laps like they were posing for a photograph. They'd been dead for weeks, but their bodies showed no signs of decomposition or animal predation. Instead, they looked almost preserved, their skin pale and waxy but intact. No obvious cause of death, Detective Santos explained as we approached. No wounds, no signs of violence. Toxicology results won't be back for days, but preliminary examination suggests they simply stopped. Tarek knelt beside Jake's body, his military experience with death allowing him to examine details that made my stomach churn. Look at their eyes. I forced myself to look closer. Both victims stared ahead with wide, terrified expressions, their pupils dilated as if they'd died in a state of absolute terror. But it was more than that. Their faces were frozen in expressions of recognition, as if they'd seen something in their final moments that had revealed a terrible truth. There's something else, Detective Santos said, leading us to the edge of the clearing. We found these carved into the trees surrounding the site. The symbols were more elaborate than any we'd discovered before, covering multiple trees in intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story, the story. Sam immediately began photographing them, his academic excitement overriding his exhaustion. It's not random, he muttered, moving from tree to tree. There's a narrative structure here, almost like a written account of what happened. You can read these, Detective Santos asked. Not exactly read, but I can see patterns. This section here, he pointed to a series of symbols carved into an oak tree, repeats elements from the other sites. And this part seems new, more complex. While Sam documented the symbols, Greg was examining the ground around the bodies. Ray, look at this. The earth around the clearing showed the same impossible tracks we'd found elsewhere, but here they formed a clear pattern, a circle around the positioned bodies, as if something had walked around and around them for hours. The depth and spacing were consistent with what we'd seen before, but there were new details visible in the soft soil. 5 toes, Greg observed, but elongated. And look at this. He pointed to a particularly clear impression. The heel pad is wrong, too narrow, too long, like a human foot that's been stretched. Anatomically impossible, Sam said, joining us, unless we're dealing with some kind of deformity or what? Or something that's not entirely human. Detective Santos looks skeptical. You're suggesting what exactly? Some kind of genetic mutation? A person with severe physical abnormalities? Before anyone could answer, we heard it again. That low, resonant humming coming from the forest around us. But this time it was different. More musical, almost like singing. And woven through it were voices we recognized. Jake Morrison's voice, Lisa, do you hear that? It's beautiful. Lisa Chen's voice, it's calling to us, Jake. We should follow it. The voices were coming from the bodies themselves, projected somehow through their mouths even though they'd been dead for weeks. Detective Santos stumbled backward, her hand reaching for her weapon, while the crime scene technician stood frozen in disbelief. That's impossible, she whispered. That's impossible, she whispered. The impossible singing continued for another minute, a duet between the dead couple describing their final moments with clinical detachment, as if they were narrating their own deaths. They spoke of following beautiful music deeper into the forest, of finding something wonderful waiting for them in a place where the trees grew thick and the sunlight never reached. Then silence returned, leaving us staring at two corpses that had somehow become ventriloquist dummies for something that understood the power of human voices. "We're leaving," Greg announced, already moving toward our vehicle. "Now." "I can't leave a crime scene," Detective Santos protested, but her voice shook. "Then stay and become the next victim," Greg replied harshly. "Because whatever did this is still out there, and it's learning to use our dead against us." The drive back to Eagle Creek passed in tense silence, each of us processing what we'd witnessed. The bodies positioned like actors on a stage, the impossible voices, the growing complexity of the symbols, it all pointed to an intelligence that was not only predatory, but actively malevolent. "It's playing with us," Sam said finally. "The staged scenes, the mimicked voices, leaving the bodies where we'd find them. This is all elaborate psychological warfare." "But why?" I asked. "What does it want?" "Maybe it's territorial," Greg suggested, "trying to drive us away from its hunting grounds." "Or maybe it's the opposite," Sam replied grimly. "Maybe it's trying to draw us in." We were still 2 miles from my station when we saw the smoke. A thin column of gray smoke was rising from the direction of my ranger station, visible above the tree line. We abandoned caution and raced down the gravel road, arriving to find my porch engulfed in flames. Greg grabbed a fire extinguisher from our truck while Sam and I used garden hoses to fight the blaze. The fire was contained to the porch and front wall, hot enough to be dangerous but localized enough to suggest it had been set deliberately. As we worked to extinguish the flames, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the front door, fresh enough that smoke still rose from the wood, was the most complex symbol sequence we'd yet encountered. It covered the entire door surface, cut deep into the oak with something sharp enough to gouge through with like butter. "It was here," I said, staring at the damage. "While we were at the crime scene, it was here." Sam was already photographing the new symbols, his hands shaking. "These are different again. More sophisticated. More urgent." "Urgent how?" "I think it's trying to communicate something specific. The earlier symbols were territorial markers, but this," he traced one of the carved lines with his finger. "This feels like an invitation." Greg had finished extinguishing the fire and was examining the surrounding area for tracks. "Here," he called from the edge of my property. Fresh prints leading toward the deep woods. The tracks were clearer than any we'd found before, pressed deep into the soft earth. But what disturbed me most was their direction. They led straight toward the hollow, the dark depression in the forest where I'd felt watched for weeks. "It wants us to follow," Sam observed. "Like hell," Greg replied. "This is obviously a trap." "Maybe," I said, studying the burned remains of my porch. "Or maybe it's tired of playing games." As if summoned by my words, the humming started again, not from the forest this time, but from inside my damaged station. The sound was coming through the walls, as if something was singing in my kitchen. We approached the front door cautiously, weapons ready. The humming grew louder as we got closer, and now we could hear voices mixed in with it, all the missing people speaking in unison like a choir of the damned. "Ray," they sang in perfect harmony, "come into the woods, Ray. Come and see what we've become, and see what we've become." I pushed open the damaged door with my rifle barrel. The interior of my station looked normal except for smoke damage and the lingering smell of the fire. But the voices were definitely coming from inside, from every corner of the small building simultaneously. "Ray," the chorus continued, "we're waiting for you in the hollow. Come and join us, Ray. Come and see the face of God." Greg grabbed my shoulder. "Don't listen to it. Don't listen to it. That's not them talking. It's using their voices." But even as he spoke, one voice separated from the chorus, a woman's voice I recognized with a shock of grief and longing. "Ray, Ray, is that you?" It was Sarah, my ex-wife Sarah, dead for 2 years from cancer, calling to me from the kitchen of my ranger station with the same warmth and love I remembered from our happiest days together. "Ray, I've been waiting for you. I'm with the others now, in the beautiful place where the trees sing. Come to us, Ray. Come to us, Ray. Come home." I took a step toward the kitchen before Greg's grip on my shoulder tightened painfully. "It's not her," he said firmly. "It's using your memories against you." But hearing Sarah's voice again, even knowing it was some kind of trick, awakened a grief I'd spent years trying to bury. The thing in the forest had somehow accessed not just the voices of its recent victims, but had reached into my past, my loss, my deepest vulnerability. "How?" I whispered. "How does it know about Sarah?" Sam had gone pale. It's been studying you, Ray. Shouldn't learning about you the same way it learned about the others. Maybe for weeks, maybe longer. The implications were staggering. If this thing could access memories, personal information, the intimate details of my life, then nowhere was safe. It knew my weaknesses, my fears, my desires. Ray, Sarah's voice called again, fainter now. Don't let them keep us apart. Come to the hollow. Come tonight. The voices faded gradually, leaving us alone in the smoke-damaged station with the terrible knowledge that our enemy wasn't just intelligent. It was personal. It had made this about me specifically, turning my own grief into a weapon. We can't stay here, Greg said. If it can get this close, if it knows this much about Ray, then we're sitting ducks. Where can we go? I asked. It's been watching me for weeks, maybe months. There's nowhere in these woods it doesn't know about. Sam was still studying the symbols carved into my door. Maybe that's not the point. Maybe running isn't what it wants. What do you mean? He turned to face us, his expression grim. I think it's been hurting us all along. The disappearances, the bodies, the fire, it's all been leading to this moment. It wants you to come to the hollow, Ray. Tonight. I looked out through my damaged doorway at the forest I'd called home for 12 years. Somewhere in those dark trees, something was waiting that knew my voice, my history, my heart. It had taken 9 people that I knew of, possibly more. It had learned to use the dead as messengers and grief as bait, and it wanted me to join them. As the sun began to set behind the tree line, casting long shadows across my burned porch, I made a decision that would either end this nightmare or make me the next voice in its horrible chorus. Then that's what we'll do, I said. We'll go to the hollow tonight. Greg stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You can't be serious. Dead serious. This thing has been picking us off one by one, playing with us. Maybe it's time to take the fight to it. Or maybe that's exactly what it wants, Sam warned. Probably, I admitted. But we can't keep running from something that knows these woods better than we do. And I can't live with hearing Sarah's voice calling to me from the forest. Lana. That night, as we prepared our weapons and planned our approach to the hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to meet something that had been waiting for us all along. Something that wore the faces and voices of the dead like masks and had saved the most personal mask for last. The face it would show me would be my own. We entered the forest at midnight, moving single file along a game trail that led toward the hollow. Greg took point with his military precision, while Sam followed with our recording equipment and cameras. I brought up the rear, familiar enough with these woods to navigate by starlight, but tonight every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal creatures, not even the sound of wind through the trees. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Our footsteps seemed impossibly loud on the forest floor, announcing our presence to whatever was waiting in the darkness ahead. About half a mile from the hollow, we found the first marker, another of those complex symbol sequences carved into a lightning-struck oak. But this one was different from the others. Instead of being cut into the bark, the symbols appeared to be burned into the wood, glowing with a faint phosphorescence that made them visible in the darkness. Bioluminescence, Sam whispered, photographing the glowing marks. Some kind of chemical reaction. Or electrical, Greg added grimly. Military uses similar marking systems for night operations. As we continued deeper into the forest, more of the glowing symbols appeared, carved into trees, burned into fallen logs, even scraped into rocky outcroppings. They formed a clear path leading toward the hollow, like runway lights guiding aircraft to landing. The message was unmistakable. We were expected. The temperature began to drop as we approached our destination, and with it came the familiar humming sound, so low it was felt more than heard. But tonight it wasn't coming from a single source. It surrounded us, emanating from the forest itself. The trees, the ground, even the air seemed to vibrate with that otherworldly music. Motion sensors ahead, Greg whispered, stopping suddenly. I moved up beside him and saw what he meant. Stretched between 2 trees at roughly eye level was something that looked like spider silk, except it glowed with the same phosphorescence as the symbols. As we watched, a small bat flew into the strand, and immediately the humming grew louder, more intense. It's a warning system, I realized. It knows when something enters its territory. We were about to find another route when Sam grabbed both our arms. Listen, he hissed. Voices were approaching through the forest, human voices talking casually as if they were on a pleasant evening stroll. But I recognized them with a chill of horror. "Beautiful night for a walk," said Jake Morrison's voice, coming from somewhere to our left. "Perfect weather," agreed Lisa Chen from our right. The voices of the dead college students were circling us, keeping pace as we moved forward, but staying just out of sight in the darkness. Soon other voices joined them. Marcus Webb discussing hiking routes, the Hendricks children laughing as they played some invisible game, Janet and Robert Kowalski planning their next vacation. "Don't listen," Greg warned. "It's psychological warfare, trying to break us down before we reach the hollow." But it was impossible to ignore the cheerful conversation of people I knew were dead, especially when Sarah's voice joined the chorus. "Ray, remember our first camping trip? You were so worried about bears," she laughed, the sound exactly as I remembered it from 20 years ago. "I told you the only thing to fear in the forest was getting lost. How ironic." I whispered, but Greg shushed me harshly. "Don't respond. Don't acknowledge it. That's what it wants." The invisible crowd of voices followed us for another quarter-mile, chattering about mundane things, whether food, plans for the future they'd never have. It was more unsettling than screams would have been, this casual conversation with the dead that made their absence feel like a cruel joke. And finally, we reached the edge of the hollow. The depression in the landscape was more dramatic than I'd remembered, dropping away into darkness like a natural amphitheater. The trees growing within it were ancient giants, their trunks so massive that 3 people couldn't have linked arms around them. Their branches formed a canopy so thick that no starlight penetrated to the forest floor below. But the hollow wasn't dark. A soft, pulsing glow emanated from its depths, like the bioluminescence we'd seen on the symbol markers, but much more intense. The light seemed to breathe, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that matched the humming sound. "Jesus Christ," Greg breathed. "What is that?" At the bottom of the hollow, perhaps 50 yards from where we stood, was something that defied easy description. It looked like a massive tree at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. The trunk was too smooth, too symmetrical, and it moved with subtle undulations like something alive. What I'd mistaken for branches were actually limbs, dozens of them, reaching out in all directions and disappearing into the surrounding forest. And covering every inch of this thing's surface were faces. Human faces pressed against the creature's skin like people trapped under ice. I could see Jake and Lisa, Marcus Webb, the entire Hendricks family, the Kowalskis, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. They were all alive, their eyes moving, their mouths opening and closing in silent communication. "That's where the voices are coming from," Sam whispered in horror. "It's not mimicking them. They're still alive in there." As if responding to his words, the faces began to speak in unison, their voices carrying clearly across the hollow. "Welcome, Ray. We've been waiting for you." The thing at the bottom of the hollow shifted, revealing more of its impossible anatomy. The smooth trunk split open like a massive mouth, exposing rows of what looked like teeth but might have been more faces, all arranged in concentric circles leading into a throat that disappeared into darkness. Soul. "Akil, don't come any closer," I called down to it, raising my rifle. "But Ray," Sarah's voice answered, and I could see her face now pressed against the creature's surface near what might have been its base. "We're all together now, one big happy family. Don't you want to join us?" "It's not her," Greg said firmly. "It's using her face, her voice, but it's not Sarah." But looking at that familiar face, seeing the warmth in those remembered eyes, I felt my resolve wavering. Sarah looked exactly as she had the day before the cancer took her, healthy and beautiful and alive. "Ray," she continued, "I know you've been lonely since I died. I know you blame yourself for not being able to save me, but you can save me now. You can save all of us." "How?" I found myself asking, despite Greg's warning grip on my arm. "Join us," said the chorus of faces. "Become part of us. We are eternal now, Ray. We are connected, unified, perfect." Sam was recording everything, his camera capturing the impossible sight of dozens of human faces embedded in the surface of something that shouldn't exist. "It's some kind of collective organism," he whispered. "A hive mind using human consciousness as processing units." "We can hear you, Sam," the faces said in unison. "You understand, don't you? We are evolution's next step. Humanity perfected. Humanity enslaved," Greg spat. "Oh," Sarah's face replied, and for a moment she seemed to speak independently of the others. Ray, it's not slavery. We're still ourselves, but we're also part of something greater. I can feel everyone's thoughts, their memories, their love. We're never alone, never afraid, never in pain. Never free, I replied. The thing at the bottom of the hollow pulsed with angry light. When it spoke again, the voice was different. Older, more primitive, like the sound of wind through empty caves. Freedom is an illusion. Raymond Callahan, a disease of isolated consciousness. We offer unity, we offer purpose, we offer immortality. You offer death, Greg shouted back. Look at those people. They're trapped prisoners in their own bodies. We are willing, the faces replied. We chose this, and you will choose it too. So you will choose it too. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The faces weren't just speaking, they were moving. The entire surface of the creature was shifting, rearranging itself, and the human faces were sinking deeper into its flesh while new ones were emerging. Fresh faces, recent acquisitions. Kowalski's, Sam breathed. They're still being processed. Janet and Robert Kowalski's faces were only partially embedded in the creature's surface, their features still distinct, still recognizably human. They were trying to speak, but only distorted sounds came out, as if they were drowning in the thing's flesh. Help us, Janet managed to gasp before her face was pulled deeper into the creature's mass. That broke whatever spell the thing had cast over me. These people weren't willing participants. They were victims, being slowly consumed and integrated against their will. Buleva. Peaceful expressions on the other faces weren't contentment. They were the result of having their personalities subsumed by the collective mind. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet struck the creature's main mass, producing a sound like tearing fabric mixed with a human scream. The thing convulsed, its surface rippling with pain, and all the embedded faces cried out in unison. You're hurting us, Ray. Sarah's face pleaded, you're hurting me. But I kept firing, emptying my clip into the creature's central mass. Greg had joined me, his military-grade rifle producing much larger wounds in the thing's flesh. Each bullet impact caused the entire organism to shudder, and I could see some of the more recently embedded faces beginning to pull free from its surface. The creature's retaliation was swift and terrifying. Those dozens of limbs that had been reaching into the forest suddenly contracted, pulling back toward the central mass like a spider drawing in its legs. But they weren't empty. Each limb was carrying something. Bodies. Human bodies in various stages of preservation, some so fresh they were still moving. It's been collecting them, Sam said in horror. All the missing people for months, maybe years. The creature began to reconstruct itself before our eyes, adding the new bodies to its mass, pressing fresh faces into its surface. I watched in sick fascination as it incorporated each new victim, their features becoming part of its grotesque collective appearance. But the most disturbing part was that some of the bodies were still alive, still conscious, their eyes wide with terror as they were absorbed into the thing's flesh. I could see them trying to scream, but no sound came out once they became part of the collective. We have to get closer, I said, reloading my rifle. We can't help them from up here. Are you insane? Greg demanded. That thing has reach we can't even calculate. Those limbs go for miles through the forest. I grinned. But even as he spoke, I was already climbing down into the hollow using tree roots and rocky outcroppings as handholds. The creature watched my descent with hundreds of eyes, all the embedded faces tracking my movement. Ray, Sarah called softly, don't fight us. Join us willingly, and the transition will be painless. Like hell, I replied, getting within rifle range of the thing's base. Up close, the creature was even more horrifying. The human faces weren't just embedded in its surface, they were integrated into its structure. Their nervous systems serving as the thing's sensory network, their brains as processing units for its alien intelligence. I could see pulsing veins connecting each face to the central mass, like roots feeding a terrible tree. But I could also see that some of the connections were incomplete. The most recently absorbed victims, including the Kowalskis, were still fighting the integration process. Their faces retained more individual expression. Their eyes still showed human consciousness. I aimed carefully and fired at the thick nerve bundle connecting Janet Kowalski's face to the main mass. The creature screamed, a sound like 100 voices crying out in pain, and Janet's face suddenly became more animated, more aware. Thank God, she gasped. Ray, it's been using us to hunt. We can see everything through its eyes, feel everything it feels, but we can't control anything. How long have you been conscious? Since it took us, we're all conscious, Ray. Every face you see, we're all still here, still aware, still trapped. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every face on the creature's surface was a person who had been imprisoned for weeks, months, maybe years, forced to participate in their own captivity. How do we free you? You can't. Sarah's face answered sadly. The integration is too complete for most of us, but the recent ones, like Janet and Robert, they might still have a chance. Greg and Sam had followed me into the hollow, despite the obvious danger. They were setting up Sam's recording equipment while Greg provided cover with his rifle. The nerve connections, Janet gasped as another wave of integration swept through the creature's mass. Cut the nerve connections before they're fully formed. I began systematically targeting the thick cables that connected the most recent faces to the central mass. Each severed connection freed a victim from the collective, but also made the creature more desperate, more aggressive. It lashed out with those impossible limbs, trying to grab us and add us to its collection. Greg's military training served us well. He managed to wound several of the reaching appendages, causing them to retreat temporarily. But the creature was learning from our attacks, adapting its strategy. Instead of trying to grab us directly, it began using the voices of the trapped victims as weapons. "Ray, please stop," Sarah begged. "You're causing us so much pain. Every bullet wound hurts all of us." "Don't listen to me, Ray," came another voice. My own voice, spoken by one of the faces I didn't recognize. "I'm not really Sarah. I'm what this thing is using to manipulate you." The psychological warfare was devastating. Hearing my ex-wife plead for mercy while simultaneously warning me not to trust her created a cognitive dissonance that made it hard to function. But I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, freeing as many recent victims as possible. I'd managed to sever the connections for both Kowalskis and was working on Marcus Webb when the creature played its final card. "Look up, Ray," it said in a voice I didn't recognize. Ancient, patient, utterly inhuman. High above us, suspended from the canopy by thick organic cables, hung a familiar figure. Dale O'Connor, my supervisor, was wrapped in what looked like a cocoon made of the same substance as the creature's limbs. "Your boss has been with us for 3 weeks, the thing continued. "And we've been using him to coordinate your activities, to guide you here. Every radio call, every instruction, that was us speaking through him." The implications were staggering. If Dale had been captured weeks ago, then our entire investigation had been orchestrated by the creature. Every decision we'd made, every clue we'd followed, had been designed to bring us to this moment. "It's been hurting us," Sam said in amazement. "The whole time it's been hurting us." "Yes," the creature admitted, its many faces smiling in unison. "And now it's time to complete the collection." The attack came from all directions at once. Limbs burst from the ground around us. Emerging from tunnels the creature had been digging for weeks. More appendages dropped from the canopy above, while others reached across the floor of the hollow. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Greg emptied his rifle at the approaching limbs, managing to wound several but not stop them. Sam was frantically trying to save his recordings, the evidence of what we'd discovered, and I was still firing at nerve connections, trying to free as many victims as possible before we joined them, or I joined them. But it was hopeless. There were too many limbs approaching too fast. Within seconds, we'd all be wrapped in cocoons, waiting our turn to be integrated into the collective. That's when I remembered something Janet Kowalski had said. "We can see everything through its eyes, feel everything it feels, feel everything it feels." If the absorbed victims shared the creature's sensory network, then they also shared its nervous system, which meant they might be able to influence its actions, if enough of them worked together. "Sarah," I called out as a thick limb wrapped around my waist. "If you can hear me, if any of you can hear me, fight back. You're not just victims, you're part of this thing now. Use that." For a moment, nothing happened. The limbs continued to tighten around us, preparing to lift us to the canopy where we'd be processed like the others. Then every face on the creature's surface began to scream. Not cries of pain or fear, but sounds of effort, of struggle, of rebellion. The recently freed victims were still connected enough to the collective to influence it, and they were using that connection to coordinate resistance among the other absorbed minds. The creature convulsed, its limbs loosening their grip as conflicting neural signals paralyzed its motor functions. For the first time since we'd entered the hollow, the thing seemed vulnerable, uncertain. Now, I shouted. While it's distracted, we broke free from the loosened limbs and ran for the edge of the hollow, but not before I grabbed the most important thing we could carry, Sam's recordings. Whatever happened to us, the world needed to know what we'd found in these woods. Behind us, the creature's screams grew louder as more and more of the absorbed minds joined the rebellion. I could hear Sarah's voice among them, no longer pleading for me to join her, but encouraging the other victims to fight for their freedom. We reached the rim of the hollow just as the creature managed to reassert control over its absorbed minds. The screaming stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that somehow felt more threatening than all the previous sounds combined. "Ray," came Sarah's voice, weaker now but still recognizable. "You can't escape. We're connected to everything in these woods. Every tree, every animal, every blade of grass, it's all part of us now." She was right. As we ran through the forest, I could feel the creature's presence in every shadow, sense its awareness in every rustling leaf. The woods I'd called home for 12 years had become a single massive organism with one terrible intelligence directing its actions. But we ran anyway, because the alternative was joining the collection of faces that decorated its surface. And as we fled through the darkness, I carried the knowledge that somewhere behind us, trapped in an alien form, the people I'd failed to protect were still fighting for their freedom. The question was whether their rebellion would be enough to weaken the creature, or if we'd simply delayed our own inevitable absorption into its growing collective. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached my damaged station, but we didn't stop running. Whatever we'd awakened in the hollow was coming for us, and our only hope was to get far enough away to warn others about what lurked in the depths of Eagle Creek State Park. We didn't stop running until we reached Millbrook, the small town 15 miles from Eagle Creek. Our arrival at the police station at dawn, covered in dirt and wild-eyed with terror, caused quite a stir among the morning shift. I'd worked with most of these officers over the years on various park-related incidents, but I'd never seen the mixture of concern and skepticism on their faces as we tried to explain what we'd found in the hollow. Chief Patricia Hendricks, no relation to the missing family, listened to our account with the patience of someone who dealt with plenty of traumatized witnesses over the years. But I could see the doubt in her eyes as we described the creature, the absorbed faces, the impossible biology of what we'd encountered. "Ray, you've been under a lot of stress lately," she said gently. 9 missing persons cases, that fire at your station. Maybe what you saw wasn't exactly what you think you saw. Then explain this, Sam said, connecting his camera to the station's computer. The footage he'd recorded in the hollow was grainy and partially corrupted, but it clearly showed something enormous moving in the darkness, covered with what looked like human faces. Chief Hendricks studied the images with growing unease. This could be digital manipulation, trick photography. You know how easy it is to fake this stuff these days. "What about the audio recordings?" Sam asked, playing back the chorus of voices we'd captured. The station fell silent as the voices of missing persons spoke in unison, describing their captivity in clinical detail. "Voice synthesis software," Officer Martinez suggested, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. Greg slammed his fist on the desk. "How do you explain this then?" He rolled up his sleeve, revealing deep gouges in his forearm where one of the creature's limbs had grabbed him. The wounds were unlike anything caused by normal animals, too precise, too geometric, as if made by something that understood anatomy at a molecular level. Chief Hendricks called in the county medical examiner to look at Greg's wounds, and Dr. Sarah Chen, coincidentally sharing a name with one of the victims, was equally baffled by what she found. "These cuts are surgically precise," she reported. "The edges are too clean for any natural predator, but the depth and pattern suggests something with multiple blade-like appendages. I've never seen injuries like this." The radio crackled with a call from Detective Santos at the state police. She'd returned to the crime scene where we'd found Jake and Lisa's bodies, only to discover that both corpses had vanished overnight. The clearing showed signs of massive disturbance, trees uprooted, the ground torn up as if something enormous had passed through. The bodies are gone, she reported. But we found something else. Tracks leading back toward Eagle Creek, and they're not like anything we've cataloged. We need a team out here now. Chief Hendricks looked at the three of us with new seriousness. If there's something dangerous in those woods, we need to evacuate the area until we can bring in proper resources. You can't evacuate fast enough, I told her. The thing we saw has been growing for months, maybe years. It's integrated with the entire forest ecosystem. Everywhere those root systems reach, it can see and hear. How far? Sam consulted his notes from our investigation. Based on the pattern of disappearances and the symbol markers we found, I'd estimate a radius of at least 10 miles from the hollow, possibly more. The implications were staggering, Anand's. A 10-mile radius would include not just Eagle Creek State Park, but portions of 3 counties and several small communities. If the creature's influence extended that far, thousands of people could be at risk. We need to contact the state authorities, Chief Hendricks decided. Maybe the federal government. This is beyond anything local law enforcement can handle. But even as she reached for the phone, I wondered if it was already too late. The creature had been patient for weeks, systematically collecting victims and studying human behavior. It had learned to mimic our voices, understand our psychology, anticipate our actions. What if it had also learned to infiltrate our communication systems? My fears were confirmed when Chief Hendricks' call to state police was answered by a familiar voice, Dale O'Connor, supposedly hanging in a cocoon in the creature's lair. Chief Hendricks, Dale's voice said through the phone speaker, perfectly normal except for a slight echo. I understand you have some concerns about the situation at Eagle Creek. I can assure you that everything is under control. Chief Hendricks looked confused. Dale, I thought you were missing. Ray said, Ray has been under considerable stress. Dale's voice interrupted smoothly. He may have misinterpreted some of the things he's seen. There's no need for outside intervention at this time. Greg grabbed the phone from Chief Hendricks. Dale, if this is really you, tell me what we discussed during our briefing yesterday. A pause. I'm sorry, Greg, but I don't recall any briefing yesterday. Perhaps you're thinking of someone else. Sam was furiously scribbling notes. It doesn't have access to Dale's recent memories, he whispered. Only what it absorbed when it first took him. Who is this really? Greg demanded into the phone. The voice that answered was no longer Dale's. It was older, more resonant, with harmonics that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the brain. We are what humanity will become, Gregory Walters. Individual consciousness is an evolutionary dead end. We offer unity, purpose, immortality. Chief Hendricks grabbed the phone and hung up immediately, but the damage was done. The creature wasn't just hiding in the woods anymore. It was actively interfering with our attempts to get help. Phone lines, Officer Martinez reported from another desk. All of them are compromised. Every call out of town is being rerouted somehow. Internet too, added Officer Park, looking up from her computer. All outside connections are down. We were cut off. Isolated in a town of fewer than 900 people, with something inhuman controlling all communication with the outside world. The creature had learned patience from its human victims, but now it was moving to the final phase of whatever plan it had been developing. The first sign of that plan came an hour later when Mayor Robert Chen, another unfortunate name coincidence, called an emergency town meeting. Word spread quickly through Millbrook's small population, and by noon, most of the town had gathered in the high school gymnasium. I should have recognized the signs immediately. The mayor's unusually calm demeanor, the way he spoke without consulting notes, the subtle wrongness in his vocal patterns. But grief and exhaustion had dulled my instincts, and it wasn't until he began his address that I realized the truth. Friends and neighbors, Mayor Chen said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed gymnasium, we face an unprecedented opportunity, a chance to transcend the limitations of human existence, to become part of something greater than ourselves. What the hell is he talking about? Someone called from the crowd. Evolution, the mayor replied, and now I could hear the other voices underneath his own, the collective speaking through him. For too long, humanity has struggled with isolation, loneliness, fear of death. But that struggle can end today. Greg elbowed me in the ribs. Look at his eyes, he whispered. Mayor Chen's eyes had the same glazed quality I'd seen in the faces embedded in the creature's surface. He was still mobile, still functional, but he was no longer entirely human. How many others? Sam asked quietly, scanning the crowd. The answer became clear as more town officials joined the mayor on the gymnasium's small stage. Police Chief Hendricks, Fire Chief Williams, School Superintendent Davis, all moving with the same unnatural calm, all speaking with subtle harmonics that suggested they were no longer acting independently. The integration process is peaceful, Chief Hendricks announced, her voice perfectly normal except for that slight echo we'd heard on the phone. Those who cooperate will experience no pain, no fear, only the joy of connection. The crowd was growing restless, confused by the bizarre rhetoric. I know rhetoric. But I noticed that some people seemed unusually calm, nodding along with the speakers as if they understood something the rest of us didn't. How long has this been going on? I asked Greg. Weeks, maybe. Remember what the creature said? It's been planning this for a long time. The mayor raised his hand for silence. To demonstrate the benefits of unity, we've arranged a special presentation. The gymnasium's lights dimmed and a screen descended from the ceiling. What appeared on it made several people in the crowd scream. It was live footage from inside the creature's hollow, showing the massive central mass with its collection of human faces. But now the faces weren't just embedded in the surface, they were speaking. Individually and in chorus, addressing the crowd directly. "Hello, Millbrook," said Jake Morrison's face, smiling with artificial serenity. "We want you to know that we're happy here, happier than we've ever been. The loneliness is gone," added Lisa Chen. "We're never alone, never afraid. We share everything, every thought, every memory, every emotion." More faces joined the chorus, including some I recognized as Millbrook residents who had supposedly moved away in recent months. They spoke of the peace they'd found, the perfect understanding, the end of human suffering. "It's a lie," I shouted, standing up in the crowd. "Those people are prisoners. They're being used as propaganda." But my voice was drowned out as the entire crowd began to murmur in unison, their voices blending into the same harmonic pattern we'd heard from the creature. Half the town had already been compromised, integrated into the collective while maintaining their apparent independence. "Ray," Sarah's face appeared on the screen, and my heart clenched despite everything I knew. "Don't fight this anymore. Join us willingly, and you can be with me again." Again, the psychological manipulation was devastating. After 2 years of grief, of missing Sarah every day, the promise of reunion was almost irresistible. But I forced myself to remember what I'd seen in the hollow, the terror in the recently absorbed faces, the way they'd fought against the integration process. "She's not Sarah anymore," I told myself aloud. "Whatever that thing is using, it's not her." But even as I spoke, Sarah's face on the screen mouthed words that only I could see. "Help us." The real Sarah, some fragment of her consciousness still fighting within the collective, was trying to communicate something, and suddenly I understood what the creature's plan really was. It wasn't just collecting individuals anymore. It was preparing to absorb entire communities, starting with Millbrook. The compromised town officials were coordinating a mass integration event, convincing people to cooperate willingly rather than forcing the issue. "We need to get out of here," Greg whispered urgently. "Now." But the gymnasium doors had been quietly closed during the presentation, and I could see more compromised individuals stationed at each exit. We were trapped in a room with several hundred people, half of whom were no longer entirely human. Mayor Chen smiled from the stage, and his voice carried new authority. "Thank you all for coming. The integration process will begin momentarily. Please remain calm and cooperate for optimal results." That's when the real horror began. The compromised individuals in the crowd started moving toward the uninfected ones, not aggressively but with calm purpose. They began talking to their neighbors, their friends, their family members, explaining in soothing voices why resistance was futile. "It doesn't hurt, Margaret," I heard Mrs. Peterson tell her sister. "You just go to sleep as yourself and wake up as part of something wonderful." "The children will be processed first," announced Superintendent Davis. "Their neuroplasticity makes integration more efficient." I watched in horror as parents who had been compromised began gathering their terrified children, speaking to them in the same unnaturally calm voices. The kids knew something was wrong. You can't fool children about fundamental changes in their parents' behavior, but they were too frightened to resist effectively. We have to do something, Sam said desperately. But what could we do? We were outnumbered, surrounded, and dealing with an enemy that could turn our own neighbors into weapons against us. The creature's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting humanity, it was converting us, using our own social structures and relationships as tools of expansion. That's when I remembered the rebellion we'd witnessed in the Hollow, the way the absorbed minds had fought against the collective when coordinated properly. If some fragment of human consciousness persisted even after integration, then maybe the compromised townspeople weren't completely lost. Sarah, I called out to the screen, hoping that fragment of her consciousness was still listening. If you can hear me, if any of you can hear me, remember who you were before. Remember what you loved about being human. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of the compromised townspeople stumbled, their calm expressions flickering with confusion. On the screen, the absorbed faces began showing signs of distress, their artificial serenity cracking. Remember your first kiss, I continued, addressing both the screen and the crowd. Remember the taste of your favorite food, the sound of your child's laughter, the feeling of rain on your face. More of the compromised individuals began to show signs of internal conflict. Whatever the creature was using to control them, it apparently couldn't completely suppress human memories and emotions. Fight it, Greg joined in. You're still human underneath whatever it's done to you. You can choose to resist. The psychological battle that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Throughout the gymnasium, compromised individuals were struggling with themselves, their programmed calm warring with recovered human emotions. Some broke free entirely, collapsing to their knees and weeping as they remembered what they'd lost. Others remained partially controlled but clearly conflicted. On the screen, the absorbed faces were experiencing similar rebellions. Sarah's face looked directly at me, and for a moment I saw the woman I'd loved looking back. Ray, she said, her voice now clearly her own. It's using our love against us. Every emotion, every memory, every connection we made, it turns them into chains. How do we break the chains? You can't free us, she replied sadly. We're too deeply integrated. But you can stop it from spreading. How? Fire, said another voice from the screen. Marcus Webb, the missing hiker. The organism is vulnerable to fire. The neural connections are organic, combustible. The forest, added Janet Kowalski. If you can burn enough of the forest, you can sever its connection to the town. The suggestion was horrifying. Eagle Creek State Park contained 12,000 acres of old-growth forest, home to countless species of wildlife. Burning it would be an ecological disaster that would take decades to recover from. But looking around the gymnasium at the compromised townspeople, at the terrified children being gathered for integration, I realized we didn't have a choice. The creature was preparing to expand beyond Millbrook, to spread across the entire region using the same tactics it had used here. If we didn't stop it now, it would eventually absorb entire states, entire countries. The fire tower, I said to Greg and Sam. There's an old fire tower on Eagle Ridge with emergency flares for marking forest fires. If we can get there. You won't make it, Mayor Chen interrupted, his voice now clearly the creature's own. We control every route through the forest. Every tree, every animal, every blade of grass serves us now. But he was wrong about one thing. I knew these woods better than any organism that had been growing in them for a few years. I knew the old logging roads, the abandoned mine shafts, the seasonal streams that didn't appear on any map. If anyone could reach the fire tower, it was me. Get to the police station, I told Greg and Sam. Gather whatever weapons and supplies you can find. I'll meet you at the fire tower in 2 hours. Ray, no, Sarah's image pleaded from the screen. If you die trying to stop this, I'll have to watch it happen. I'll have to experience your death through the collective. And if I don't try, I'll have to watch it consume everyone I care about. I kissed my fingers and pressed them against the screen where her face appeared. I love you, Sarah. I love you, Sarah. The real you, not whatever this thing is pretending to be. I love you too, she whispered. Now go. And don't look back. Getting out of the gymnasium required a combination of luck, desperation, and the chaos caused by the ongoing psychological rebellion among the compromised townspeople. In the confusion, Greg and I managed to create a distraction while Sam slipped out through a service exit. The three of us regrouped at the police station where we loaded up on weapons, ammunition, and anything else that might be useful. The radio was still compromised, but we found an old CB unit that seemed to be working. Sam used it to broadcast a warning to anyone who might be listening, describing what was happening in Millbrook and the surrounding forest. Then I set out alone for the fire tower, leaving Greg and Sam to coordinate whatever resistance they could organize among the uncompromised townspeople. The route I chose avoided all the main trails, following deer paths and creek beds through sections of forest I hoped were still free of the creature's influence. But I was wrong about that. No. As I made my way through the woods, I could feel the creature's presence everywhere, in the way the trees seemed to lean inward, blocking sunlight, in the unnatural silence that followed my movements, in the subtle vibrations I felt through the ground with each step. It was watching me, tracking my progress, probably planning how to stop me. But it was also patient, confident in its ultimate victory. It had been growing for years, slowly extending its influence, learning human behavior. A few more hours wouldn't matter to something that thought in geological timescales. That patience might have been its only weakness. The fire tower sat on Eagle Ridge, the highest point in the park, connected to the forest floor by a winding staircase that switchbacked up the granite slope. From the top, you could see for miles in every direction, all the way to Millbrook, all the way to the hollow where this nightmare had begun. I reached the base of the tower just as the sun was setting, painting the forest in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The emergency flare kit was still in its sealed box, unchanged since the last inspection. Tug. Enough concentrated phosphorus to start fires across several square miles of forest if used strategically. As I climbed the tower's metal stairs, I could hear the creature moving through the forest below. Not just one organism now, but dozens of its limbs, converging on my position. It had finally decided that patience wasn't enough. From the top of the tower, the view was breathtaking and terrifying. I could see the hollow glowing in the distance, its phosphorescent light visible even in the twilight. But I could also see other lights scattered throughout the forest. Smaller concentrations of the same bioluminescence, probably satellite colonies connected to the main organism. The creature was even larger than we'd imagined, its root system extending throughout the entire park and beyond. But that extensive network might also be its vulnerability. If I could start enough fires in the right places, I might be able to sever the connections between the various parts, isolating the main organism in the hollow. I began launching flares systematically, aiming for the areas where I'd seen the phosphorescent glow. Each flare exploded into brilliant light, then settled into the forest canopy and began to burn. Within minutes, I could see smoke rising from multiple locations. The creature's response was immediate and furious. The entire forest seemed to convulse, trees swaying without wind, the ground trembling with seismic activity. And from somewhere in the distance came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. The collective scream of thousands of absorbed minds experiencing pain simultaneously. "Ray!" Sarah's voice called from the forest below, but when I looked down, I couldn't see her. "Ray, please stop." "You're hurting all of us." "I know," I called back, launching another flare. "I'm sorry." The fires were spreading quickly through the dry undergrowth, creating a network of flames that began to merge into larger blazes. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe at the top of the tower. But I kept launching flares until the entire emergency kit was exhausted. By then, fires were burning across thousands of acres of Eagle Creek State Park. The creature's screams had given way to something like sobbing, the sound of an ancient intelligence experiencing loss for the first time in its existence. From my vantage point, I could see the effects of the fires on the organism's network. The phosphorescent glow was dimming in areas where the flames had reached, suggesting that the neural connections were indeed vulnerable to fire. If the burns were extensive enough, they might sever the creature's control over the compromised humans in Millbrook. But the fires were also spreading beyond the areas I'd targeted, threatening to consume the entire park and possibly spread to populated areas. I'd started an ecological disaster that might kill more people than the creature had absorbed. As I watched the flames spread through the forest I'd called home for 12 years, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made since the first disappearances. Could I have found another way to stop the creature? Could I have saved more of the victims? Could I have prevented this entire situation if I'd acted sooner? The questions would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. The fire reached the base of the tower just after midnight. I had enough water in my emergency kit to last maybe another day, but the metal structure would become unbearably hot long before then. My choice was to burn with the forest or climb down and face whatever was waiting in the flames below. I chose to climb down. Eon. The descent through the burning forest was like walking through hell. The air was thick with smoke and superheated gases that seared my lungs with every breath. Falling branches and burning debris made every step a gamble. But somehow I made it to the bottom of the ridge, where I found something I hadn't expected. Greg and Sam were waiting for me with a Park Service truck, along with a dozen other survivors from Millbrook. They'd fought their way through the compromised townspeople and driven into the burning forest to find me. "How did you know where I'd be?" I asked, climbing into the truck's cab. "We didn't," Greg replied, putting the vehicle in gear. But the fires created enough chaos to break the creature's control over the compromised people. About half the town snapped out of it once the neural network got disrupted. And the other half, still compromised but weaker, confused, they're not coordinating anymore. We drove through burning forest for what felt like hours, following old logging roads and fire breaks toward the park's eastern boundary. Behind us, Eagle Creek State Park was being consumed by flames that would burn for days, leaving nothing but ash and charred stumps where ancient trees had stood. But ahead of us lay the outside world, where people would need to be warned about what we'd found in these woods. The creature might be wounded, isolated, but it wasn't dead. And there might be others like it, growing in other remote forests, learning patience as they prepared their own harvests of human consciousness. We reached the highway just as dawn broke over the smoke-filled landscape. In the distance, I could see fire department vehicles racing toward the park, too late to save the forest, but hopefully in time to contain the blaze before it spread further. As we drove away from the flames, I thought about Sarah's face on that screen, the brief moment when she'd looked at me with her own eyes instead of the creature's. Whatever fragment of consciousness survived within the collective, I hoped the fires had given her some measure of peace. The official reports would blame the Eagle Creek fire on drought conditions and a lightning strike. The disappearances would be attributed to the victims getting lost in the subsequent chaos. My testimony about the creature in the hollow would be dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. But Sam's recordings survived, along with Greg's photographs and my detailed reports. They're stored in secure locations now, waiting for the day when the world is ready to believe that humanity isn't alone on this planet, and that we're not necessarily at the top of the food chain. The park was closed indefinitely after the fire, though I heard rumors that researchers from various government agencies had found things in the burned areas that raised more questions than they answered. The hollow itself was reportedly filled with concrete and classified as a hazardous site. I took that job in the state office that Dale had suggested, trading the wilderness for a desk and four walls. It's safer here, surrounded by other people, with multiple communication systems and emergency protocols. Key. But sometimes, late at night when the building is empty, I swear I can hear that low humming sound echoing through the ventilation system. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the city, I'll see someone whose eyes have that same glazed quality I remember from the compromised townspeople in Millbrook. They smile and nod as if they recognize me, as if they're waiting for the right moment to deliver a message from something that's still growing somewhere in the darkness, still learning, still patient. The forest is gone, but the roots run deep. And I'm beginning to suspect that what we found in Eagle Creek was just one small part of something much larger, something that's been watching humanity for far longer than we've been aware of its existence. Every night I dream of Sarah's face pressed against alien flesh, calling my name from within a collective consciousness that spans continents. And every morning I wake up wondering if today will be the day I hear that voice not in dreams, but speaking through someone standing right beside me. The thing about nightmares is that they don't end when you open your eyes. Sometimes they're just beginning.